You are lying in complete darkness. Not the darkness of a city bedroom where streetlight edges through curtains, not even the darkness of a rural house where moonlight finds windows. This is the darkness inside a log cabin in northern Canada. January. 40 below zero outside, and the only light comes from thin red lines where the stove door doesn't quite seal. You can hear the fire breathing, a low murmur of flame working through wood, the occasional pop when sap ignites. Beyond the walls, the forest is silent in the way only extreme cold creates silence. No wind, no movement, just the slow tick of trees contracting as moisture freezes deeper into their cores. You are a day's snowshoe journey from the nearest human, perhaps farther. The cabin measures 12 feet by 14. Every gap between logs has been chinked with moss and mud. The sleeping platform sits 2 feet off the floor where cold air pools. Beneath you, spruce boughs still hold their scent. Over you, wool blankets and fur. This is not comfort. This is survival that has become routine. In an hour, you will wake just enough to add wood to the fire. You will do this twice more before dawn. You have done it every night for 8 weeks. You will do it every night until the ice breaks in April. But for now, wrapped in layers that trap your body's heat, listening to the stove's quiet work, you let the day's exhaustion pull you down. Let your breathing slow. Let the cold stay where it belongs, outside the small, warm world you have built. Let us go back to how this shelter came to exist and how men learned to sleep through winter nights when the forest itself seemed to freeze solid. The trapper's cabin was not built for comfort. It was built as a calculation against cold. Every dimension, every choice of material, every detail of placement reflected one purpose: creating a space small enough that a single wood stove and a human body could keep each other alive through the night. 12 feet by 14 feet, sometimes smaller. 10 by 12 was common. A few were as compact as 8 by 10. Stand in the center of such a space and extend your arms. You can nearly touch both side walls. This was intentional. Volume mattered. A large room dissipated heat. A small room concentrated it. The difference was not philosophical. It was the difference between waking in the morning or not waking at all. The cabin sat where the trapper had chosen carefully, not in the deep forest where snow piled heavy on the roof and branches blocked what little winter sun existed, not on exposed hilltops where wind found every gap, instead along the edge of a frozen river, or beside a lake, or at the junction where a creek met larger water. These locations offered advantages that stacked together. Waterways became winter highways, once frozen solid. A trapper could move on snowshoes along the smooth ice much faster than breaking trail through forest. His dog sled, if he had one, could pull supplies over the flat white surface. Water also meant the land opened slightly. A narrow clearing where a cabin received more daylight during the brief winter hours when sun angled low through the trees. And water meant the landscape revealed itself. From his door, the trapper could see weather approaching, could read the sky, could judge if conditions allowed work or demanded staying close to shelter. The cabin faced south when possible, not for sentiment, for sun. In December and January, sunlight reached the northern forest for perhaps 6 hours. If the door and single window faced south, those hours sent whatever thin warmth existed directly into the interior. Logs for the walls came from standing dead trees. The trapper cut them in fall before snow depth made the work impossible. Spruce and pine were common, not because they were ideal, but because they were abundant. He looked for trees already dried, their bark loose, their wood seasoned by years of standing dead in the forest. These cut cleaner than green wood, weighed less for hauling, and crucially, they had already completed the shrinkage that occurred as timber dried. A cabin built from green logs would develop gaps as the wood contracted over its first winter. A cabin built from dead standing timber held its dimensions. The walls rose in horizontal courses, each log notched at the corners where it met the perpendicular log. French-Canadian trappers used the saddle notch, a rounded groove cut into the underside of each log to fit over the one below. This created a joint that locked together under the building's weight. No nails, no pegs, just the compression of wood on wood, friction and gravity, holding the structure together. Between the logs, gaps existed, a finger's width, sometimes wider where a log had natural irregularity. These gaps received chinking. The trapper gathered moss from the forest floor in late summer when it was still pliable. He mixed it with mud from the riverbank, clay if the soil offered it. This mixture pressed into every seam between logs. The chinking dried slowly, contracted slightly, often required a second application. Some trappers added a final seal of mud mixed with animal hair from hides they processed. The hair acted as a binder. When this dried, it formed a surprisingly effective barrier. The roof sat low, just high enough to stand beneath the ridgeline. Poles laid across the top wall logs formed the roof's framework. Over these the trapper placed bark, long sections peeled from birch if available, or overlapping strips of spruce bark. Then moss, a thick layer, 6 inches or more, then soil, dug from an area where the ground hadn't yet frozen, carried in, and spread over the moss. This created weight that held everything in place. It also created insulation. Snow would pile on this roof all winter, adding more insulating mass. The low pitch meant snow stayed rather than sliding off. Inside, the ceiling was barely 6.5 feet at its peak, lower at the edges. A tall man learned to move carefully, but low ceilings kept heat from rising too far above where it mattered. The space between a man's sleeping platform and the roof surface was minimal. Warmth concentrated there. The door was small, perhaps 5 feet high. Thick planks split from logs and bound together with crosspieces, leather hinges, or if the trapper had iron hardware, metal ones brought from a trading post. The door fit tightly. Gaps at its edges received the same careful chinking as the walls. One window, small, sometimes just a single pane of real glass carried in at great effort, more often a frame covered with scraped hide or oiled canvas that admitted some light while blocking wind. Glass was a luxury. It was also fragile. A shutter could be closed over the window at night for additional insulation. The floor was packed earth, frozen solid by January. Some trappers laid split logs as floorboards if they planned to use a cabin for multiple seasons. Most simply accepted the earth, sometimes covered with spruce boughs that provided slight insulation from the frozen ground. This was the shelter, small, dark, sealed against the cold as thoroughly as skill and available materials allowed. Not a home. Not in the sense of comfort or permanence, but a carefully constructed tool for staying alive. A small, warm pocket in a landscape where cold was the dominant fact of existence. The trapper knew every inch of this space, every log, every gap he had chinked, every place where frost would appear on the walls when temperatures dropped far below zero. He knew it. Because he had built it. Because his life depended on it, and because for the next 4 months this small room would be the only shelter between himself and the kind of cold that turned flesh black and stopped hearts. The cabin was not alone. 15 miles to the east, another cabin stood beside a different frozen stream. 15 miles west, a third, north and south the same. A constellation of shelters spread across territory measured not in acres but in the days required to cross it. This was the trapline, a circuit, a route through wilderness that could take 2 weeks to walk in winter, returning the trapper finally to where he started, ready to begin again. Each cabin marked a day's travel from the next. Sometimes less if the terrain was difficult, sometimes more if ice conditions were good and a man could make distance. The trapline followed logic written into the landscape itself. Frozen rivers connected the cabins like roads, though roads that shifted each year as ice formed differently, as channels that were safe one winter might break through the next. The trapper learned his territory the way another man might learn the rooms of a house. This ridge meant north. That creek bend meant he was 3 hours from the next cabin. The distinctive shape of a burned area told him where his traps were set in the willows beyond. But knowledge of place was one thing. The weight of isolation was another. From November through March he might see no other human face. Not occasionally, not rarely, not at all. The trade-in post where he had left in fall was now unreachable. Snow too deep, distance too great, and there was no reason to go. His work was here in the cold, checking traps and moving between cabins, taking animals whose pelts would be valuable when he finally returned to civilization in spring. Other trappers worked other territories, but territories were respected. A man did not cross into another's lines. To do so was not merely rude, it was dangerous. Conflict in isolation had no arbitration, so the forest between trap lines became a kind of border, unmarked but understood. He was alone. The silence of this aloneness had texture, weight. In the first weeks, men often talked to themselves, narrated their actions as they worked. Now we'll check the set by the beaver dam. Need to move carefully here. Ice is thin. The we was interesting, as if company existed where none did. Some trappers brought dogs, a husky or mixed breed that could pull a small sled, help track, and provide something living to address. The dog slept in the cabin, ate from the same pot, became not a pet but a partner in survival. Those without dogs sometimes found themselves speaking to the stove, thanking it when fire caught quickly, cursing it when damp wood smoked. The cabin itself became a presence, a personality. This one had a draught that pulled well, that one always smoked when wind came from the west. The third was tight and warm, but somehow oppressive, its logs seeming to press inward. Trappers developed preferences, looked forward to reaching certain cabins on the circuit, dreaded others, but all of them were sanctuary. However crude, however small, they were the points of safety in a landscape that offered none elsewhere. The land between cabins was not hostile exactly, it was indifferent. The forest in deep winter achieved a kind of stillness that felt almost geological. Trees stood locked in cold, snow lay undisturbed except for animal tracks. The sky appeared closer somehow, as if the cold compressed distance. Beauty existed, but it was the beauty of something utterly unconcerned with human presence. The frozen river, smooth and white and promising easy travel, might betray a man if he stepped wrong and went through into water that would kill him in minutes. The trees that looked identical could mean the difference between finding the next cabin before dark or spending a night trying to stay alive in the open. Even time felt different. There were no clocks, no schedules. Day and night were the only divisions that mattered, and in January even those became strange. Dawn came late. Dusk fell early. The short day between was all the time available for work. The trapper woke when instinct said to wake, slept when exhaustion or darkness demanded it. His body became the clock, and it told time by cold, by hunger, by the sun's position when sun existed. Months blurred together. One day was very much like the one before. Check traps, move to the next cabin, process any animals taken, cut wood, melt snow for water, sleep, wake, repeat. This repetition was not monotonous in the way that word usually means. It was meditative, automatic. The work required attention, but not conscious thought. The mind went elsewhere, while the body performed tasks it had performed 1,000 times. Some men found peace in this. The isolation became not loneliness, but relief from the complications of human society. No obligations except survival. No conflicts except those with cold and distance. Others found it harder, craved voices, craved news, craved the simple presence of another person in the room. But all of them adapted, because adaptation was not optional. The territory became known in a way that perhaps no one else would ever know it. This spruce grove, that willow thicket, the particular way snow drifted against the ridge, the spot where a wolverine had torn apart a trap 2 years ago. Intimate knowledge, earned through months of moving through the same space, reading the same signs, following the same frozen rivers that led from one small cabin to the next. And always the understanding that this was temporary. Spring would come. Ice would rot. The trapline would become impassable as water returned and snow melted into impassable mud. He would gather his winter's furs, load what he could carry, and make the long journey back to the post where other humans existed, where he could sell his pelts, resupply, and remember what voices sounded like in conversation. But that was months away. For now there was only this, the territory, the circuit, the cabins, and the long nights between them. The cabin began with standing dead timber, not living trees, not green wood. A trapper walked his territory and marked the dead spruce or pine that still stood upright, already dried, bark loose or gone. These were the ones he wanted. Wood that had seasoned on the stump for years, light enough to move alone, dense enough to hold against the cold, and crucially, wood that would not shrink after the walls were raised. Green logs seemed easier at first, abundant, faster to fell, but green wood held water in its fibres. As the cabin's first winter passed, those logs would dry and contract. Gaps would open between them, gaps that let in wind, gaps that turned a warm shelter into a cold one, gaps that could kill. So the trapper chose dead timber. He felled it with an axe, limbed it where it lay, dragged or carried each log to the building site. The work took weeks, sometimes longer, but the wood was already ready. The logs were notched at the corners, simple saddle notches cut with an axe. Each log settled into the one below it. The weight of the wall held itself together. No nails, no pegs, just the friction of wood on wood and the downward press of mass. But logs alone did not make walls. Between each round of timber, gaps remained. Irregular spaces where the curved surfaces did not meet perfectly. Some gaps were narrow, others wide enough to push a hand through. Left open, they would funnel cold air into the cabin like a dozen small rivers. The trapper could bank the finest fire in the north, and still the cold would find its way inside through those gaps. This was where chinking began. The trapper gathered moss from the forest floor, sphagnum if he could find it, dense and fibrous. It grew in wet places, in the shade of spruce in low ground near creeks. He pulled it up in handfuls and packed it into sacks, or piled it near the cabin. Moss was soft when gathered. It could be pressed and shaped. It filled irregular gaps better than any rigid material. He stuffed the moss between the logs, working from outside first, then inside, pushing it deep into the gap with his fingers or a flat stick, packing it tight, compressing it so it would not fall out when it dried. The moss formed the foundation of the seal, then came the mud. He dug clay if the ground offered it, mixed it with water. Sometimes he added dried grass cut fine, sometimes animal hair saved from hides he had scraped. The fibres bound the mud together, kept it from cracking as it dried. The mixture became thick, almost like dough. He pressed this mud over the moss, smoothing it with his hands, filling every visible gap, creating a seal that would harden as it dried. The mud did not need to be beautiful. It needed to be complete. In some places he used only moss and mud. In others he mixed in wood ash to help the clay set. In the coldest regions, trappers learned from the Métis and indigenous builders to add spruce gum, boiled and softened, which sealed against moisture and held through freeze and thaw. The chinking was not done in a day. He worked his way around the cabin, section by section, outside walls first because they faced the weather, inside walls after because they faced the stove's heat and needed to hold that warmth inside. When the chinking dried, he checked it. Gaps sometimes reappeared. The mud cracked. The moss settled. He filled them again. This was not a single task. It was a seasonal one. Each autumn before the deep cold arrived, he walked the cabin's perimeter and inspected the seams. He recharged what had failed. He added layers where the wind had found weakness. The roof required different thinking. Some trappers used birch bark if they built in birch country. Long sheets peeled from fallen trees, layered like shingles, overlapping to shed water and hold snow. Birch bark did not rot quickly. It curved and flexed without splitting. Others used spruce bark or split shakes, thin wooden slabs, split from straight-grained logs with a froe and mallet. The shakes were layered in rows from the bottom edge of the roof upward, each row covering the gaps in the row below. In some cabins the roof was poles laid close together, covered with sod, grass and roots still attached. The sod was laid in 2 layers, the second placed so its roots grew into the first. When snow fell, it piled onto the sod and stayed there. The snow itself became insulation. A foot of snow on the roof was not a problem, it was an advantage. The door was the final gap. Trappers built small doors, low openings that required a person to duck. This was deliberate. A small door opened less space to the outside, less cold air rushed in, less warm air rushed out. The door itself was thick, hewn from split logs, or assembled from planks if the trapper had a saw. It hung on leather hinges or wooden pins. Around the door frame he chinked carefully. Extra layers of moss, extra mud. He knew the door would be opened and closed many times each day. The frame had to hold against that movement and still seal against the cold. Some cabins had no window, others had one small opening covered with scraped hide or oiled paper that let in grey light, but kept out wind. Glass was rare, heavy to carry, easily broken. A man living alone 2 weeks' travel from the nearest post did not risk glass. He accepted darkness. Darkness did not freeze him. When the cabin was finished, it looked small from outside. Rough. The logs were uneven. The chinking was visible as pale lines between darker wood. The roof sat low. There was no decoration, no carving, no paint. But the gaps were filled. The cold had no easy path inside, and when the stove was lit, the heat it made stayed where it was needed. The cabin was not a home in the way that word meant comfort. It was a tool, a survival technology built from trees, moss, mud, and understanding. It worked because generations of men had built them this way and lived through the winter to build them again. Inside, the cabin measured 10 feet by 12, sometimes smaller, rarely larger. The dimensions were not arbitrary, they were calculated. A space small enough that a single wood stove could heat it. A space large enough that a man could move, work, and store what he needed to survive. Every object had a place. Every place had a reason. The stove sat near the centre of the room, slightly offset toward the front wall, not against a wall, not in a corner, in the open, where its heat could radiate in all directions. The stovepipe rose from the top, passed through the roof above, sometimes angling toward the back to draw heat along the ceiling before exiting. That length of pipe gave up warmth to the air before the heat escaped outside. Around the stove, the cabin's life was arranged. Firewood occupied one full wall, stacked from floor to ceiling. The wood nearest the stove was what would burn that day and night, dry, ready. Within arm's reach, even in darkness. Behind that row, the next day's wood. Behind that, the reserve. A man did not go to bed unless wood enough for 2 days sat inside. Cold and deep snow could arrive without warning. The woodpile was not storage, it was insurance. The wood was stacked with care. Largest logs at the bottom, split pieces above, kindling in a separate pile near the stove. Birch bark, if he had it, kept dry in a sack or tin. The arrangement was not for appearance, it was for speed. At 40 below, fire building was not leisurely. Every motion had to be direct. Opposite the woodpile, along the other wall, hung the trapper's tools and clothing. Snowshoes on wooden pegs. The rifle always inside overnight so the metal would not ice and the wood would not crack. Traps cleaned and ready. A coil of snare wire, an axe, a knife in its sheath. His outer parka and mitts hung to dry after the day's work. Below these, sometimes a rough shelf. On it, salt, flour, tea, baking powder in tins, beans or rice in sacks, salt pork or bacon in cloth, bannock wrapped to keep dry. These were not luxuries. They were calories, fuel for a body burning heat against the cold. The sleeping bunk was built into the back wall. It ran the width of the cabin, or most of it. A platform of poles, sometimes planks if the trapper had them, raised 18 inches off the floor, sometimes 2 feet. This elevation mattered more than anything else about the bed. Cold air sank. It pooled on the floor like water. On the coldest nights, the temperature at floor level could be 20 degrees colder than the air at head height. To sleep on the floor was to sleep in the coldest part of the cabin. The raised bunk lifted a man into warmer air. It also kept him above the draft that slid along the floor toward the stove's intake. The bunk's frame was simple. 4 corner posts if it was freestanding, or 2 posts at the front if the back was built against the wall. Crosspieces supported the platform. On top of these, smaller poles laid close together, sometimes lashed with cord. The surface was not flat. It was uneven. but it did not need to be flat. What mattered was that it held weight and allowed air to pass beneath. Above the bunk, sometimes a shelf. Narrow, just deep enough for a few items. A journal if the trapper kept one, a stub of candle, matches in a tin, tobacco. Small things that needed to be within reach in the dark. The floor was dirt or rough planks. Dirt was more common, packed hard from use. It did not rot. It did not need to be carried in. In some cabins, the trapper laid spruce boughs over the dirt near the stove, replaced them when they broke down. The boughs kept his feet off the cold ground and added a smell of resin to the air. There was no table. Sometimes a stump dragged inside served as a seat or a surface. Sometimes a section of log split flat on top. Sometimes nothing. A man ate standing or sitting on the edge of the bunk or crouched near the stove. Furniture was weight and bulk. It took up space that could hold firewood or food. The door opened inward. This was important. Snow piled against the door overnight. If it opened outward, the snow would block it. A man could be trapped inside. An inward opening door could be forced against snow, pushed until there was space enough to slip out and clear the drift. Near the door, a pair of boots, mukluks, or moccasins for inside, heavier boots for outside. Keeping them near the door meant they could be pulled on quickly. In an emergency, seconds mattered. The space above was mostly empty. Smoke rose there, hung near the ceiling, seeped out through gaps around the stovepipe. Sometimes pelts were stretched on frames and hung to dry in that upper air. Fox, marten, lynx if he was lucky. The pelts were valuable. They justified the trapper's presence in this place, but they did not determine the cabin's layout. Survival did. Light came from the fire or from one small coal oil lamp, used sparingly. Coal oil had to be packed in. It was heavy, expensive, limited. Most tasks were done by firelight or by touch in darkness. The trapper learned the cabin's geography by memory. He could move from door to stove to bunk to woodpile without seeing. He knew how many steps, where to reach, what his hand would find. This was the 10 by 12 world. Not comfortable, not decorated, but organized with absolute clarity. Each object placed according to need, each need anticipated, nothing wasted, nothing decorative. It was a space that asked one question: will this help me survive the night? If the answer was yes, it stayed. If no, it did not exist. At the center of the cabin sat the stove, not decorative, not a luxury. The iron box or barrel that defined whether a man lived or died through the winter night. Most trappers relied on what was called a box stove. Cast iron, simple construction, 4 walls, a top, a door in front, a pipe rising through the roof. The entire unit small enough to be hauled on a toboggan through the forest, compact enough to fit in a 10-foot cabin, without dominating the limited floor space. Weight was a consideration. These stoves were carried long distances, but they couldn't be too light. Thin metal meant cracks, warping, failure when it mattered most. In the Northern Territories, another design appeared, the Yukon stove. Barrel-shaped rather than square, often constructed so it could be disassembled into sections, body, door, pipe, then reassembled at the cabin site. This portability mattered when a man was breaking a new trail or establishing a line far from settlements. The stove performed every function necessary for survival. It heated the air. That was primary. But it also dried wet clothing, hung on lines strung overhead. It melted snow in pots for drinking water and washing. It cooked bannock and beans and salt pork. And on the longest nights when coal oil was too precious to burn in lamps, the stove provided the only light, the red glow visible through seams and the small mica window in the door casting flickering shadows against log walls. The stove had a character. Every trapper learned this. It had moods that changed with fuel type, with how the wood was stacked, with outside temperature and wind direction. It made sounds, the pop of pitch pockets in spruce, the steady tick of expanding metal as heat built, the roar when the draft was opened and oxygen-fed flames. These sounds became familiar, expected, almost comforting in their predictability. A man learned his stove the way he learned the habits of animals on his line. He learned how it drew air, where to position logs for even burning, how much to open the damper for maximum heat versus slow overnight burning. He learned the temperature of the metal by sight, the dull warmth of low fire, the cherry glow when pushed hard, the dangerous red that meant he'd overfired and risked cracking the iron. The relationship wasn't sentimental, it was practical. The stove was a tool, but it was the tool that allowed every other tool to function. Without it, the traps froze shut. The body couldn't recover from cold. Food remained frozen. Sleep became impossible. Maintenance was constant. Ashes had to be cleaned out regularly or they'd choke the fire. The pipe needed checking for creosote build-up, especially when burning green wood or resinous spruce, because a chimney fire in a log cabin miles from help meant potential catastrophe. Door hinges and damper mechanisms were kept free of rust and ash. Any crack in the iron body was noted, monitored, sometimes patched with stove cement if available. The stove sat on a base of flat stones or sheet metal to protect the wooden floor from heat and falling embers. Around it, a zone was maintained, clear of anything that could ignite, no wood stacked too close, no clothing hung directly overhead. This discipline wasn't optional. Position mattered. Most trappers placed the stove toward the center of the cabin rather than against a wall. This allowed heat to radiate in all directions. The sleeping bunk was positioned to receive warmth, but not so close that direct heat became uncomfortable or dangerous during the night. The stove became the organizing principle of the interior space, everything related to it. Distance from the stove determined temperature. The stove determined where you worked, where you sat, where you slept. On the coldest nights, 40 below, 50 below, the stove worked continuously. Even when banked for slow burning, it was never truly off. The cycle never stopped from November through March. Wood went in, heat came out, ashes accumulated. The process repeated. Understanding the stove meant understanding heat transfer. Cast iron absorbed warmth and radiated it slowly. This was different from steel, which heated quickly but cooled quickly. The iron held temperature. Even after flames died to coals, the metal continued releasing stored heat into the cabin's air. The stove wasn't separate from the trapper's body. It was an extension of his survival system. He fed it as he fed himself. He monitored it as he monitored his own warmth. The stove's temperature and his body's temperature existed in relationship. When one dropped, the other followed. At night, lying in the bunk under layers of wool and fur, a man could read the stove without seeing it. The quality of sound told him the fire's state. The shifting light against the walls told him flame height. The temperature of air on his face told him whether he'd wake in 2 hours or 4 to add wood. The stove was the heart. Everything else, walls, roof, door, bedding, existed to protect and enhance what the iron box provided. Simple, functional, irreplaceable. The fire had to last through darkness. This wasn't a matter of comfort, it was survival. The difference between waking in a cold cabin and waking in a frozen one. The difference between adding wood to coals and starting from scratch in brutal cold. Trappers called it banking the fire. The term was exact. Like a riverbank holds water, this technique held heat, contained it, controlled its release, made it last. The process began an hour before sleep. First, the fire was burned down deliberately, not extinguished, reduced. The goal was to create a deep bed of hot coals. These coals were the foundation. They held intense heat with minimal flame. They would sustain combustion through the night hours. Wood selection for overnight burning was critical. Hardwood was ideal, dense wood that burned slowly. In areas where it grew, white birch was excellent, maple if available. Tamarack, softwood but unusually dense, worked well in the northern forests. These woods created long-lasting coals. They released heat steadily rather than in quick bursts. The wood had to be seasoned, not green. Green wood was heavy with moisture. It sputtered, created more smoke than heat, left creosote deposits in the stovepipe. But it also couldn't be too dry. Completely dried softwood, spruce pine, jack pine, burned too fast. It flared hot and disappeared, leaving insufficient coals for the night ahead. What trappers wanted was wood cut the previous season, dry enough to burn clean, dense enough to last. The overnight logs were larger than daytime fuel, thick pieces, sometimes called backlogs. These were positioned carefully on the coal bed, not thrown in, positioned, placement mattered. The logs were set parallel to each other with small gaps between. Too tight and air couldn't circulate, too far apart and heat dispersed. The arrangement allowed oxygen to reach the coals beneath, while the wood above burned down gradually. Then came the damper adjustment. Every stove had a damper, a metal plate in the stovepipe that controlled draft. Open damper meant maximum airflow, hot fire, fast burning. Closed damper meant restricted air, slower combustion, longer burn time. For overnight banking, the damper was partially closed. Not completely. That could extinguish the fire or cause dangerous smoke build-up in the cabin, but closed enough to slow everything down. The fire shifted from active burning to a kind of controlled smoulder. Some stoves also had an intake damper on the door or body. This controlled air entering the firebox from below. It was adjusted in coordination with the pipe damper to create the exact rate of burn needed. The result was a fire that no longer produced visible flames. Instead, the logs glowed. Heat radiated from their surfaces. They combusted at the molecular level, breaking down slowly, releasing energy over hours instead of minutes. A properly banked fire would maintain the cabin temperature above freezing for 6 to 8 hours. Not warm, a banked fire wasn't meant to keep the cabin comfortable. It kept it survivable. The interior might drop to just above freezing, but that was enough. Enough that water didn't freeze solid. Enough that fingers could still function when the trapper woke to add wood. Before settling into the bunk, the trapper prepared for night feeding. 3 or 4 pieces of split wood were placed within arm's reach, not across the cabin, not requiring him to leave the warmth of blankets and furs, right beside the sleeping platform where he could reach them in darkness. This preparation mattered because he would wake. Every trapper did. 2 times, sometimes 3. The body developed an internal sense of the fire's rhythm. When temperature dropped past a certain point, consciousness surfaced. Not full waking, a partial awareness, enough to extend an arm, open the stove door, add a log to the coals, close the door, adjust the damper slightly if needed. The entire process could take less than a minute. Often the trapper didn't fully emerge from sleep. The actions became automatic, ritual, performed in near darkness with only the faint glow from the stove providing light, then back under the furs, back into warmth. The fire renewed for another cycle. This rhythm of night feeding wasn't a disruption. It became the natural cadence of winter sleep. The body adapted, expected it, incorporated it. The alternative was unacceptable. A fire allowed to die completely meant waking to a cabin at 40 below, meant struggling with numb fingers to rebuild flame from kindling, meant an hour or more of work in dangerous cold before heat returned, meant potential frostbite, hypothermia, or worse if something went wrong, so the fire never died. From the first cold night in October or November until the final thaw in March or April, the stove maintained its presence. The iron stayed warm. The coals remained alive. The cycle continued. This was the science, not complex, but exact. Understanding how wood density affected burn time, how damper position controlled oxygen, how coal beds stored heat, how the timing of night feeding prevented disaster. The trapper didn't think of it as science. He thought of it as what you did to survive until morning. But it was knowledge, precise knowledge, accumulated over generations, passed from experienced men to newcomers, refined through cold nights and near failures and the understanding that came from living alone in a place where mistakes had immediate consequences. The fire banked, the wood positioned, the dampers set, and then sleep, trusting the process, trusting that warmth would hold through darkness. The woodpile was not decoration, it was insurance. It was visible proof that a man had prepared for the night. A stack of split logs beside the cabin door meant warmth could be sustained, meant the fire would not go hungry, meant survival was not left to chance. Most trappers kept several cords stacked within reach of the entrance, not inside where it would take up precious space and bring moisture and insects, but close, near enough that even in a blizzard, even in darkness, a man could step out and return with an armload in seconds. The work of maintaining that supply was continuous. On any day with available light, if the trapline was complete, if there was an hour to spare, the axe came out. The sound of splitting wood carried through the winter forest. Sharp cracks that echoed between frozen trees, the rhythm of the blade biting into birch or spruce, the sound of a man taking control over the night ahead. This was not casual work, not something done when convenient. It was essential labor, as essential as checking traps or mending snowshoes, because running low on firewood was dangerous. It meant cold. It meant waking to a dead fire and no fuel to restart it. It meant hours lost to emergency cutting, when those hours could cost fingers or toes to frostbite. A trapper who let his woodpile shrink too far had to abandon other work, had to leave the trapline and devote entire days to replenishing supply, cutting, hauling, splitting, stacking, all while temperatures sat at 30 or 40 below. Better to stay ahead, to make wood gathering part of the routine, to never let the pile fall below what 3 nights would require. Standing dead timber was preferred, trees killed by fire or disease or age. They had dried while standing. Their wood split cleaner, burned hotter, produced less creosote to clog the stovepipe. Birch was prized for its high heat. Spruce and pine burned faster, but were easier to find. Tamarack was dense and long-burning if you could locate it. Each species had its character. Each played a role. The trapper learned his forest, learned where the dead birch stood in a grove 2 miles west, where a lightning-struck spruce had fallen but remained dry beneath its own branches, where to find what he needed without wasting daylight on searching. He cut logs to stove length, 16 to 18 inches, short enough to fit through the firebox door, thick as a man's thigh or forearm, depending on the burn he wanted. Large logs for overnight banking, smaller splits for quick heat in the morning. Splitting was done with a belt axe or a felling axe, depending on what he carried. The logs were set on a chopping block. The blade fell along the grain. White wood opened in clean halves. Those halves were split again into quarters. Quarters into smaller pieces for kindling. Every piece was stacked. Bark side up so rain or snow would shed. Rows built against the cabin wall or on a raised platform to keep the bottom logs from ground moisture. The pile grew, solid, reassuring. A man could stand beside his woodpile and know he had done what needed doing. The work was physical, shoulders and back and arms, breath coming hard in cold air, sweat beneath wool even at 20 below. But it was satisfying work, tangible. Each log split and stacked was a piece of the night accounted for. And when the day's cutting was finished, when the axe was hung and the new wood added to the pile, there was a particular kind of rest that came from knowing the fire would not want. The cabin would stay warm. Sleep would be possible. The cold could do what it wanted outside those log walls. Inside there would be flame, there would be heat, because the wood was ready. Because a man had spent his daylight making certain of it. That certainty was worth every hour spent with the axe, every frozen finger, every ache in the shoulders. The woodpile was survival made visible, stacked in cords, measured in nights, a barrier against the cold that a trapper built one split log at a time. Sleep did not come uninterrupted. The fire demanded attention 2 times, 3 times, sometimes 4 on the coldest nights. This was not a disruption. It was the rhythm, the expected cadence of winter rest. A trapper did not sleep through the night the way a man in a city might, did not sink into 8 hours of unbroken darkness. That kind of sleep was not possible. Not when the fire was the only thing standing between warmth and cold that could kill. Instead, he learned a different pattern, lighter sleep, more attuned. His body developed an internal clock that woke him when the stove needed feeding, not from noise, not from cold at first, just from practice, from months of the same routine until it became automatic. The waking was partial, semi-conscious, minimal movement. He surfaced just enough to know the fire had burned down, to feel the slight chill that meant the cabin's warmth was fading, to understand without fully thinking that logs were needed. The body moved before the mind completely woke. One arm emerged from the blankets, then the other. The cold hit immediately. Not extreme yet, but noticeable. A reminder of what waited if the fire died completely. Some trappers kept mittens beside the sleeping platform, heavy wool mitts that could be pulled on without looking, protection for hands that would touch cold iron and frozen wood. The stove sat close, within reach or a few steps away depending on the cabin's layout. He moved toward it, still wrapped in blankets if he could manage it, dragging wool and fur along rather than fully leaving their warmth. The stove door opened. A squeak of hinges, a wave of heat from coals still glowing inside. Firelight illuminated the small space, red and orange. Shadows moving on log walls. He reached for wood. The stack was always positioned within arm's length. Logs selected earlier, dry splits ready to place. No need to go outside, no need to search. 2 logs, sometimes 3. Fed into the firebox on top of the coal bed, placed carefully, positioned to catch and burn slow. The door closed, the damper adjusted if needed. A few seconds to make sure the wood caught, to see flame begin to curl around the new fuel, then back to the sleeping platform, back under the layers, burrowing into the warmth that had been preserved by the blankets and furs during his absence. The whole process took perhaps 2 minutes, maybe 3. The trapper did not fully wake, did not think through what he was doing. It was muscle memory, practiced routine. His body knew the movements, his hands knew where the wood sat and how the stove door opened. He settled back into the furs, pulled the blankets close, let his breathing slow again. Within minutes, he was asleep, or nearly so, drifting in the space between waking and true rest. The temperature steadied. The fire consumed the fresh logs. Heat spread through the small cabin once more. Hours passed. The fire burned down again. The cycle repeated. Another waking, another emergence from warmth into cold air, another feeding of the stove, another return to sleep. This was not hardship. Not to the trapper who had lived it for months or years. It was simply how winter nights were survived. Tending the fire through darkness was not an interruption of rest. It was the structure of rest. The framework that made sleep possible at all in a place where the air outside could freeze exposed skin in minutes. The night was divided into segments: sleep, wake, feed fire, sleep again, wake, feed fire, sleep. By the 3rd or 4th month of winter, the pattern was so ingrained that a trapper barely remembered the wakings. He rose, he fed the fire, he slept, all without conscious decision. And in the morning, when grey light finally came and he woke fully and rebuilt the fire into roaring flame, he could not always say how many times he had woken in the night, only that the fire had not died, that the cabin remained warm enough, that he had survived another night through the simple repetition of an act performed half asleep in darkness. The fire had been fed, the cold had been held back. That was enough. The sleeping platform was not built at floor level. It stood raised, 18 inches in most cabins, sometimes 24. This elevation was not for convenience. It was physics made into carpentry. Cold air sinks, heat rises. Inside a cabin heated by a single stove, the difference between floor level and bunk level could measure 20 degrees, sometimes 30. A man sleeping on the floor slept in the coldest layer of air in the structure. The heaviest cold settled there like water pooling in low ground. It accumulated through the night as warmth rose toward the ceiling and the fire burned lower. The raised bunk lifted a body out of that settling cold, up into air that held the day's retained warmth longer. Air that received fresh heat each time the stove was fed. The trappers who built these cabins understood this without thermometers or formal study. They knew it from experience, from nights spent on the ground before cabins existed, from waking with frost on blankets that touched the floor while the air above remained merely cold rather than killing. So they built platforms. The construction was simple. 4 posts driven into the earth floor or wedged against walls, cross poles notched and fitted. Sometimes split logs laid across to create a sleeping surface, sometimes just poles spaced close enough to support boughs and bedding without sagging under a man's weight. The wood was usually spruce or pine, whatever stood nearby and could be cut without travelling far. The joints were not fine, gaps existed between poles. The frame creaked when weight shifted, but it held, and it lifted. In some cabins the bunk was built into the corner farthest from the door. This placement put the sleeper in the most protected position, 2 log walls at his back, the stove between him and the entrance, the structure itself blocking drafts. In others the bunk ran along one wall. This design left more floor space for movement and work. It meant the sleeper lay parallel to the stove rather than facing it. Either way, elevation mattered more than position. The platform became a shelf of survivable air, a zone where blankets and fur could do their work without fighting the constant drain of floor-level cold, where a body's warmth had a chance to accumulate in the microclimate of bedding rather than leaking down into frozen air. Some trappers laid boards across the pole frame if lumber was available. This created a more finished surface, easier to arrange bedding, less likely to shift during sleep. Most used only poles. Boards meant extra weight to haul, extra cost if purchased, extra work if milled by hand. Poles worked. They had worked for generations. The sleeping platform marked territory within the cabin, defined space, this area for rest, the rest for living. At night, when the fire burned low and cold began its descent, the bunk became an island, a refuge built at the right height, high enough to escape the worst cold, low enough that a man could reach the floor to add wood without fully leaving his blankets. The principle was simple. Cold falls. Don't sleep where it lands. The sleeping platform needed a mattress, not for comfort, though comfort came, for insulation. Wood conducts cold. A man lying directly on poles or boards would lose body heat through contact. The platform would draw warmth from his back and legs all night. The elevation would help, but not enough. So trappers built a barrier between body and wood. The most common solution was spruce boughs, fresh-cut boughs from the trees that surrounded every cabin, the small branches with needles still attached, cut in lengths from 1 to 3 feet, gathered by the armful. A proper bough bed required volume, not a thin scattering. A thick mattress of layered branches piled 6 to 8 inches deep across the entire sleeping platform. The technique was specific. Boughs were laid with cut ends toward the wall and tips pointing outward. Each layer overlapped the one below. The needles created a surface that gave underweight but held its structure. The air trapped between branches provided insulation. The result was springy, aromatic, surprisingly comfortable. The scent filled the cabin, sharp and clean, the smell of living wood. It mixed with wood smoke and hide and wool. It marked the space as inhabited by someone who knew how to use what the forest provided. The boughs did more than smell pleasant. They created a layer of trapped air between the sleeper and the cold platform. Air is among the best insulators available. The boughs held that air in thousands of small pockets. Each needle, each gap between branches, each space where wood didn't quite touch wood. A man lying on 6 inches of spruce boughs was not lying on wood. He was lying on trapped air held in organic architecture. The boughs compressed over time. After 2 weeks, sometimes 3, they lost their springiness. The needles dried, the branches flattened. The mattress that had been 6 inches thick became 4, then 3. When this happened, the old boughs were pulled out and tossed into the stove. Fresh ones were cut and laid. This work happened on a calm day, when temperature rose above miserable, when a man could spare an hour to walk into the trees with a hatchet and return with arms full of new branches. Some trappers used alternatives when spruce was scarce or when they wanted something different. Dried grass made a mattress, if enough could be gathered before snow came. It was stuffed into a canvas tick, a large flat bag sewn shut. The tick kept the grass contained, prevented it from scattering across the platform. Moss worked similarly, gathered from rocks and trees in drier months, packed into a tick or piled loose. Hay, if a trapper had access to it from a distant settlement or trading post, served the same purpose. But hay meant hauling. Spruce meant stepping outside with a hatchet. Spruce won. Some men laid a caribou hide over the boughs before adding blankets, hair side up. This created another insulating layer and a softer surface. The hide kept moisture from breath and body from soaking into the boughs as quickly. Others went directly from boughs to blankets. The mattress was not permanent, it was not precious. It was rebuilt as needed with materials that cost nothing but an hour's work. But while it was fresh, it worked. It lifted the body off the cold wood. It held warmth close. And every night a man burrowed into fur and wool, knowing that beneath him, trapped in the needles of a dozen spruce branches, was air that would not steal his heat. That mattered. In cold that could kill, it mattered completely. Building a bed for winter was not decoration, it was engineering. The trapper began with the spruce boughs, green and aromatic, laid thick across the pole platform. Over these he spread wool blankets, Hudson's Bay point blankets most often, heavy fabric woven tight, 3.5 or 4 points, the weight denoted by short black lines woven into the corner. Each point represented one beaver pelt in the old trading system. A 4-point blanket had cost 4 prime pelts. It was payment made in the currency of survival. The blankets went down fur side up when fur was present, but most often they were simply wool, dense, still holding body heat even when damp. The wool formed a barrier between the man and the spruce beneath, between warmth and the wood platform that would draw heat away through the night. But wool alone was not enough. Over the blankets came hide, caribou most commonly, moose where caribou did not range. The hide was placed fur side up, creating the surface on which the trapper would lie, the fur against his body, the skin beneath, tanned soft but still holding its structure, formed a layer that would not compress the way wool did. Caribou hair was hollow. Each strand held air. The hide was a field of insulation, thousands of tiny pockets that trapped warmth and held it close. A moose hide was heavier, thicker, the hair shorter and denser. It lacked the caribou's lightness, but it was durable. And in the southern traplines, where moose were more common than caribou, it served the same purpose. Warmth from below, a surface that breathed but did not conduct cold. The principle was older than the trapper's grandfather. Insulation beneath the body mattered as much as covering above, more perhaps. A man lying down compressed, whatever was under him. Wool blankets, no matter how thick, flattened under body weight. The air between fibres was pressed out. What remained conducted cold upward from the platform, from the floor, from the frozen ground, beneath the cabin. A trapper could pile 10 blankets over himself and still wait cold if he lay on only one beneath. The men who survived understood this. They built their beds from the ground up. First the elevation, the platform 18 inches off the floor where the coldest air pooled, then the boughs creating airspace and cushion, then wool for its warmth even when wet, then hide for its uncompressed insulation and the thousands of hollow hairs that defied the cold. This was the foundation, the base upon which the night would be spent. Some trappers added a second hide if they had one, layered crosswise over the first. Others used a damaged beaver pelt, too torn or rubbed to bring good price but still warm. The pelt went fur down against the caribou hide, creating a double layer of fur with the leather between. The philosophy was simple. Trap air, prevent compression, insulate from below. The cold did not only descend from above, it rose from beneath. It moved through any gap, any compressed fibre, any material that conducted rather than resisted. The difference between a bed built correctly and one built in haste was the difference between sleep and misery, between warmth and the slow, creeping cold that woke a man shivering at midnight, forced to rise and feed the fire because his bed had failed him. The trappers did not write manuals. They built beds that worked, and they survived, and the knowledge passed through demonstration and cold experience. By the time a man had spent one full winter on the line, he knew that the foundation mattered most, that what lay beneath him would determine whether he rested or suffered. The bed was not complete. The foundation was only the first half. But it was the half that failed first when done poorly, and the half that made everything else possible when done right. The trapper smoothed the caribou hide flat. He checked the edges where it overlapped the platform, ensuring no gap existed where cold air could rise. He pressed his hand against it, feeling the give of the boughs beneath, the firmness of the hide. It was ready. The bottom half of warmth. Now came the covering. The blankets went on next. Wool. 3 of them at minimum, 4 when the cold pressed deepest. The first blanket lay directly over the sleeping man. Heavy wool, the weave tight enough to block wind, but loose enough to hold air between the fibres. It covered from chin to feet. The trapper tucked the edges under his body, sealing the warmth beneath, preventing drafts from entering the cocoon he was building. The second blanket overlapped the first, placed slightly offset so that no single seam ran the length of the bed. Seams were weak points, places where cold could push through. By staggering the blankets, the trapper ensured that every gap in one layer was covered by solid fabric in the next. The third blanket completed the wall, 3 layers of wool, 3 barriers of fibre and trapped air. Together they weighed 15 pounds, perhaps 20, enough weight to press down and hold heat close, but not so much that they compressed the layers beneath. On the coldest nights, a 4th blanket was added, but the 4th was different. It was not placed directly over the man. It was laid across the top of the other 3. Its purpose not to add warmth, but to hold the warmth already created, to seal the system, to prevent the heat rising from the man's body from escaping into the cabin's cold air. This was the philosophy. Layering created air pockets. Each boundary between materials, between wool and wool, between wool and fur, trapped a film of still air. Still air was insulation, moving air was cold. The more layers, the more boundaries, the more trapped air. The warmer the man, but blankets alone were not enough. When the cold reached 30 below, 40 below, when the cabin's interior temperature dropped near freezing despite the fire, wool could not hold the night back. Fur was the final layer. A fur robe, if the trapper had one, went over everything. Bare hide was the prize, thick and heavy, the fur long and dense, the skin large enough to cover a grown man entirely. A black bear taken in autumn had fur in prime condition, the guard hairs glossy, the underfur soft and deep. The hide, once tanned and softened, became a blanket that weighed 30 pounds and held warmth like no woven fabric could. The trapper laid it fur side down. Against the wool beneath, the fur created the final barrier. The long hairs trapped air, the skin blocked wind, the weight held everything in place. Beneath that robe, under wool and fur, the heat generated by a human body had nowhere to go. It stayed. It accumulated. It turned the space between the blankets into a climate separate from the frozen cabin. Not every trapper had bear. Many used rabbit. Rabbit skin robes were common, made from dozens of skins, sometimes 100 or more, sewn together with sinew or thread. Each skin was cut into strips. The strips twisted so the fur spiraled outward, then woven or tied into a large blanket. The result was light, far lighter than bear, but the fur was dense, the air pockets countless, and the warmth remarkable. A rabbit robe could be folded in summer and stored. It took up little space, it weighed almost nothing. But laid across a man on a cold night, it performed as well as any hide. Some men used wolf, lynx, sewn pelts of fox or marten when larger hides were unavailable. The principle remained the same. Fur over wool, the combination of materials, each contributing its strength. There was a variation. Some trappers placed the fur robe fur side up, as the outermost layer. The logic was different, but the result similar. Fur facing outward reflected heat back downward. The glossy guard hairs did not absorb cold. They shielded the layers beneath. Either way worked. What mattered was the fur itself. On the worst nights, trappers added one more element, their daytime clothing, the wool coat, the fur hat, the moose hide mittens. These were piled on top of the blankets and robes, adding weight and thickness, not worn, but laid across the body as additional insulation. Every piece of fabric in the cabin that could contribute warmth was drafted into service. The bed, when complete, was a structure. 12 inches of material between the man and the cold, spruce and wool and hide beneath, wool and fur above, air trapped in layers, heat sealed within, the system tested by generations of men who had learned through freezing what worked and what failed. It was not comfort, it was sufficiency. The trapper crawled into this architecture as the cabin cooled. He pulled the blankets tight around his shoulders. He felt the weight of the fur settle over him. Beneath him the caribou hide held firm. Above him the wool and the robe created a darkness that was also warmth. The cold was outside this space. The night could do its worst. Inside the layers there was warmth enough to last until morning. The trapper did not undress for sleep. Not fully, not in the way a person in a heated house might prepare for bed. The cold did not permit it. When the time came to burrow into the layered bedding on the raised platform, he was already wearing wool underwear against the skin, long wool bottoms, a wool undershirt, thick wool socks pulled high beneath the underwear legs. These base layers stayed on through the night. They had warmed to his body temperature through the day. They held that warmth close. Removing them would mean exposing skin to air that was already dropping toward freezing inside the cabin. It would mean losing the heat his body had worked all day to generate. So the base layers remained. Over them, Through the day, he had worn outer garments, a heavy wool shirt, moose hide pants, a fur parka if he had been outside working the trapline, thick mittens, felt bootliners inside moccasins or mukluks. These outer layers came off as he prepared for sleep. But they did not go far. They became part of the bed itself. The fur parka, heavy with the weight of caribou or wolf hide, was laid across the top of the blankets. The moose hide pants, stiff with cold and use, were spread over the foot of the bed. These were not set aside on a hook or bench, they were added to the pile. Extra weight, extra insulation, another barrier between the sleeper and the air that would grow colder as the night deepened. Some trappers placed their outer clothing directly over their bodies beneath the blankets, fur side inward. The principle was the same. Every layer counted. Every piece of material that could trap air or block cold was deployed. The hat stayed on, always, a wool toque pulled low over the ears, sometimes down to the eyebrows. The head was a source of immense heat loss. Uncovered, it radiated warmth into the cold cabin air all night. Covered, that heat stayed closer to the body, stayed in the bed. The difference was not minor. A bare head could make the difference between restful sleep and shallow, shivering wakefulness. Some men slept in two hats, a thin wool cap beneath a thicker one. In the coldest weeks, when temperatures outside fell past 40 below and the cabin's interior hovered just above freezing by morning, even the face required consideration. A scarf or neck warmer could be pulled up over the nose and mouth, but this created a problem. Breath was warm, breath was moisture, exhaled into fabric. That moisture condensed. It froze. Ice formed on the scarf, on the edge of the blanket, on any surface near the mouth and nose. So most trappers learned to create a breathing space. They did not cover the face fully. They arranged the top blanket or fur robe so that a small gap remained. A vent. Air could move. Breath could escape without freezing directly onto the bedding. Cold air could enter, but it was a trade. Moisture was the greater enemy over time. Ice accumulation in the blankets reduced their insulation. Added weight made them stiff and less effective. On rare, sunny winter days, bedding was taken outside. Blankets were draped over lines or laid on clean snow. The dry, cold, and sunlight would freeze dry the accumulated moisture, the ice would sublimate, the wool would recover some of its loft. But those days were infrequent. Most of the winter, the bedding simply accumulated the evidence of breathing, of survival. Frost formed. Ice built up where warm breath met cold fabric night after night. There was no alternative. Sleep required breath. Breath produced moisture. Moisture froze. The trapper managed it as best he could and accepted what could not be changed. Some men kept clothing inside the bed for another reason. In the morning, the cabin would be coldest. The fire would have burned low or gone out entirely. The air would be sharp and painful. Dressing in clothing that had been hanging on a peg meant pulling frozen fabric onto skin. Dressing in clothing that had spent the night in the bed meant pulling on garments that were still slightly warm, or at least not frozen. A shirt kept under the blankets near the body, bootliners tucked into the foot of the bed, small measures. But in the moment of leaving the warmth of furs and blankets, they mattered. The trapper climbed into bed wearing wool. He pulled outer garments over himself. He kept his hat on. He adjusted the blankets and furs around his shoulders and created a breathing gap near his face. He was dressed for survival, not comfort, not the sleep of soft beds in warm rooms. He was dressed for the night in a cabin where the fire might hold and the temperature might not drop too far, but where no guarantees existed, where cold was the constant condition, where clothing was not removed, it was rearranged, redistributed, made part of the architecture of warmth he built around himself before the darkness and the long hours ahead. The trapper's breath became ice, not immediately, not in a single exhalation, but over hours through the night, the moisture in each breath condensed on whatever surface it met. And in the cold, condensation froze. The problem was invisible at first. Warm air left the lungs. It carried water vapor. When it reached the edge of the blanket near the face or the fur of the robe pulled close, the vapor cooled. It condensed into tiny droplets. Those droplets froze. A thin layer of frost formed, then another, then another. By morning, the edge of the blanket could be stiff with ice. The fur around the face might hold a visible crust. Moisture had travelled from the body into the bedding, and there it stayed, frozen. This was not a small concern. Ice in the bedding added weight. It made the blankets and furs rigid. Worse, it reduced their ability to insulate. Wool worked by trapping air in its fibres. Ice displaced that air, compressed the fibres. A blanket heavy with frozen moisture was a blanket that no longer held warmth as effectively. Over days and weeks the accumulation worsened. The bedding grew heavier, colder, less forgiving. So the trapper learned to manage his breath. He did not cover his face completely. Some men tried. They pulled the blanket over their heads entirely, seeking to trap every bit of warmth. But they woke to find the blanket frozen to their beard, their moustache, the skin of their cheeks. The moisture had nowhere to go. It froze in place. Instead, the trapper created a vent, a gap at the top of the bedding. He arranged the blankets so they came up to his chin, his neck, but not over his mouth and nose. He left a space, small, just enough. Cold air could enter, breath could escape. The system was not sealed. It was a trade. The vent let cold air reach his face. His nose and cheeks remained exposed to temperatures well below freezing, but the moisture from his breath vented outward into the cabin rather than inward into the bedding. The blanket stayed drier. The frost still formed, but less of it, slower. On some nights when the cold was extreme, he pulled a scarf loosely across his face, loose enough to allow air movement. The scarf itself would freeze, stiffen with ice by morning, but it was easier to dry a scarf than to dry a heavy wool blanket or a fur robe. The breathing space became instinct. He adjusted it without thinking. Half asleep in the night, waking to add wood to the fire, he would feel the blanket's position and adjust. Too close to his face, moisture building. Too far, cold air pouring in. There was a balance. He found it each night. Morning revealed the evidence. Frost on the inside of the blanket, ice crystals on the edge of the fur. Sometimes, if the night had been particularly cold and his breathing space poorly managed, a thin sheet of ice on the wool near his face. He would scrape it away with a thumbnail, shake the blanket. The ice would fall in small fragments to the floor, but the deeper moisture remained. The ice that had formed within the fibres, that could not be shaken out. That required drying. Drying bedding in winter was difficult. The cabin's interior was cold. Hanging a blanket near the stove would dry the side facing the heat, but the other side remained damp. And there was rarely time. The trapper's days were consumed with running the trapline, cutting firewood, maintaining equipment, preparing food. Bedding dried when it could, which was not often, so he waited for the rare, clear day. The kind of day when the sun appeared in a pale winter sky and the air was calm. On those days he carried the blankets outside. He draped them over a line strung between trees or laid them flat on clean snow. The combination of cold and sunlight created ideal conditions. The moisture in the fabric froze solid, then sublimated. Ice turned directly to vapor without passing through a liquid stage. The air was so dry and the sun so bright that the wool and fur gave up their moisture to the sky. By afternoon the blankets would be lighter, stiff at first from the cold, but dry. He brought them back inside, let them warm near the stove. The wool regained some of its loft, the fur softened. That night the bedding would feel different, less heavy, more alive, but those days came perhaps once every 2 weeks, sometimes less. The rest of the time the trapper slept in bedding that carried the weight of frozen breath, of nights and nights of moisture gradually accumulating. It was part of the condition, part of what winter sleep meant in a cabin where warmth was relative and nothing stayed truly dry. He managed it. He vented his breathing space. He shook out frost each morning. He dried the bedding when sun and cold aligned, and he accepted that the blankets and furs would never be as light or warm as they had been at the start of winter. They would carry the season's moisture. They would grow heavier, and he would sleep under them anyway, because they were what he had, and they were enough. The trapper returned to his cabin in the failing light of late afternoon. Winter daylight was brief, 6 hours, perhaps 7 on a clear day. The sun rose late and set early, and the period between was short enough to measure in tasks completed rather than hours past. He timed his return carefully, not at full darkness, not stumbling through the forest with frozen hands trying to find the door, but an hour before, perhaps 2. Enough time to perform the work that would carry him through the night ahead. The cabin sat dark, cold, silent. It had been empty since morning, the fire dead or nearly so. The interior air almost the same temperature as the world outside. Frost forming on the nails that penetrated the walls. The stillness of a space that had surrendered its warmth back to the winter. He stood for a moment at the door, not hesitating, assessing. The sky behind him still held a grey light. The snow reflected what remained of the day, but darkness was coming. It always came, and the sequence of tasks ahead had to be completed in order, without rushing, without skipping steps. He pushed the door open. The interior was darker than outside. His eyes needed time to adjust. The familiar shapes emerged slowly. The stove at the centre, the sleeping platform along the wall, the rough table, the stacked firewood, everything as he had left it. The first task was the fire. Always the fire. He moved to the stove and opened the door. The hinges creaked slightly. Inside, the firebox was mostly ash, grey and fine, but underneath, when he prodded gently with the poker, he found what he was looking for: coals. A small bed of them, red when he disturbed the ash covering, still holding heat from the morning's fire. This was valuable. Coals meant he could rebuild the fire without starting from nothing. Without birch bark and shavings and the careful patience of coaxing flame from spark. The coals were already heat, already combustion. They only needed fuel and air. He worked methodically. First he scraped the ash away from the coals, gently, preserving them, exposing them to air. They brightened slightly. The red intensified. Then kindling. He had prepared it yesterday. Small splits of dry spruce. Fine pieces that would catch quickly. He laid them over the coals, not smothering them, creating space for air to move, building a structure that would allow flame to spread upward. The kindling began to smoke, then to blacken at the edges where it touched the coals, then to burn. Small flames appeared, yellow and tentative at first, growing as the wood heated and released its gases. The fire was returning. He added slightly larger pieces, still dry, still chosen for their quick combustion. The flames strengthened. The draught in the chimney began to pull. The characteristic sound of a living fire, the soft crackling, the subtle roar of air moving through wood, filled the small space. Only then did he add the larger logs, split birch, dense and slow-burning, positioned to catch the flame but sized to burn for an hour or more. These would establish the heat. These would warm the cabin's interior and provide the sustained fire needed for the work ahead. He adjusted the damper slightly. The stove's design allowed control of airflow. Too much air and the fire burned hot but fast, consuming wood without establishing coals. Too little and it smouldered, producing smoke instead of heat. The correct setting came from experience, from knowing this particular stove, from understanding how it drew on cold evenings versus mild ones. The cabin began to warm, not quickly, not dramatically, but the edge came off the cold. The air near the stove lost its knife-sharp quality. The metal of the firebox ticked and pinged as it expanded in the heat. He left the door open, not the cabin door, the stove door, just slightly, just for now, to maximize the heat radiating into the room while the fire established itself. Outside, the light continued to fade. The window, a single small pane of glass set into the wall, showed grey becoming darker grey. The trees outside were losing their definition. The snow still held some luminescence, but that, too, was dimming. He had perhaps an hour of working light remaining. The fire burned steadily. Now the immediate crisis of cold was addressed, but the evening's work was not finished, not remotely. Water came next. There was no well, no pump, no stream flowing nearby that remained unfrozen. Water meant snow, and snow meant work. He took the large pot from its place near the stove. It was blackened from use, cast iron heavy. It had hung over fires and sat on stovetops for years, accumulating the carbon and creosote that comes from constant heating. He stepped outside. The cold hit him immediately. The cabin had warmed only slightly. The fire was too new, but even that small warmth made the outside air feel sharper by contrast. His breath clouded. The snow under his boots squeaked with the particular sound that meant deep cold. He scooped snow into the pot, not the top layer. That was often contaminated with debris or too loose to pack efficiently. He dug down slightly, finding the denser snow underneath, packing it firmly into the pot, filling it completely. It took surprising volume. Snow was mostly air. When melted, it reduced drastically. A pot that seemed full would yield perhaps a third of its volume in water, sometimes less. For enough water to drink, to cook with, to have available for morning, he would need to fill this pot multiple times. He carried it back inside. The pot went directly onto the stove's surface. The flatness of the top allowed it to sit stable. The heat from the firebox below transferred through the cast iron. The snow began its transformation, first softening, then collapsing, then the first appearance of liquid at the bottom. Steam rose from the surface. The process was slow. The pot sat and heated and gradually turned solid into liquid. While it worked, he prepared food. Bannock first, flour from the sack, a handful measured by eye, salt, baking powder if he had it, though supplies ran low as winter progressed, water, just enough to bind the flour into a thick dough. Mixed in a tin bowl with his hands, the dough was dense, heavy. It held together when he patted it into a flat cake. The frying pan went on the stove beside the water pot. A small piece of lard melted in the pan's bottom. When it began to shimmer, he laid the bannock in. It cooked slowly. The bottom browned. The smell of baking flour filled the cabin. After several minutes, he flipped it. The other side browned. The interior cooked through from the residual heat. This was bread. Simple, plain, but hot and filling. While the bannock finished, he prepared the rest. Beans from yesterday, already cooked, soaked overnight and boiled that morning before he left. They had sat cold all day but would warm quickly. He spooned them into a smaller pot and placed it near the stove's edge where heat was gentler. Salt pork next. A small piece cut from the slab that hung from a nail. The fat was important. Fat was calories. Calories were heat. He sliced it thin and laid the pieces in the pan after removing the bannock. The pork sizzled. Fat rendered out. The meat curled and browned. The water pot was perhaps a third full now. He added more snow, packed it in on top of the water. The melting continued. Tea would come last. After eating, boiled strong and black in the same pot, once enough water had accumulated. The cabin was warmer now, noticeably so. The stove radiated heat in all directions. The air closest to it was almost hot. The far corners remained cold. That would not change, but the space around the stove, where he sat to eat, held enough warmth to remove the edge of discomfort. He ate directly from the pan. Bannock torn into pieces, beans scooped with the bannock, salt pork chewed slowly. The food was simple, but it was hot, and that mattered more than complexity. His body responded. The warmth of the meal spread from his stomach outward. Internal heat to supplement the stove's external heat. Together they began to reverse the cold that had accumulated in his core during the day outside. He ate everything. There were no leftovers, no waste. What was prepared was consumed. The body required fuel just as the stove did. Winter was not a season for restraint. When the pan was empty, he set water to boil for tea. The pot was full enough now, more than half water. He pulled out a few handfuls of unmelted snow and set them aside for later. The water heated quickly, already warm from the melting process. Tea went in directly. No strainer, no bag, just loose leaves in the boiling water. It steeped, while he added more wood to the fire. When he poured it into his cup, he poured carefully, leaving the settled leaves at the bottom of the pot. The tea was hot enough to require small sips. He sat on the edge of his sleeping platform, cup in both hands, the warmth of the liquid spreading through his fingers, steam rising into his face. Outside, the window showed only darkness now. The day was gone. The night had arrived. And inside the cabin, the fire burned steady. The stove ticked. The temperature held. He had eaten. The fire was established. Water was prepared for morning. The evening's foundation was laid. The day's work was finished. The traps had been run. The body was tired, but evening held its own tasks. They were small tasks, quiet tasks, the kind that could not be skipped. First, the wet things. Snowshoes hung near the stove where heat could reach them. Not too close, close enough. The babiche webbing, rawhide strips woven across wooden frames, held moisture from the day's travel through deep snow. If that moisture froze overnight, the webbing would crack. A cracked snowshoe this far from anywhere was a serious problem. Wool socks draped over a line strung above the stove, mitts turned inside out to expose the damp interior, moose-hide moccasins positioned where warmth could pull the moisture free. Everything that had been against skin or snow needed drying. Moisture was the enemy, more than cold itself. Then the traps. The steel traps used tomorrow sat near the fire now, each one inspected. Trigger mechanisms tested with a stick, springs checked for ice, chains examined for weak links. A trap that failed to fire meant a day's travel wasted. Worse, it meant an animal moved through uncaught, the opportunity lost. Some trappers cleaned traps with boiling water to remove human scent. Others rubbed them with balsam boughs. Methods varied. The principle did not. The trap must work. The rifle came inside. It leaned in the corner farthest from the door. In extreme cold, metal became brittle. Firing mechanisms could freeze. A rifle left outside overnight might not fire at all come morning, and a rifle that would not fire was no rifle at all. The coal oil lamp sat on the small table. Its flame was steady, small, controlled. Light cost money. The can of coal oil had been carried in by canoe or dog team months ago. When it emptied, there would be no more until spring, so the flame was kept low. Tasks were done quickly. Nothing was wasted. Some evenings there was reading, a Bible maybe, or a catalogue from the Hudson's Bay Company, read so many times the trapper knew each page. The words were less important than the ritual, the act of sitting, of focusing on something beyond the day's cold work. Other evenings there was writing. A few trappers kept journals, short entries, the weather, what was caught, observations about animal movement. The writing was practical, not philosophical, but it served a purpose. It marked time. It proved the days were real, not simply blurred together into one long winter. Some smoked a pipe. The tobacco was rationed like the lamp oil, a pipeful in the evening. The small luxury of it, the routine, the few minutes of sitting with no task in hand. But most tasks were done without the lamp. Firelight was enough. Trappers learned to move in dim orange glow, to find things by memory, to work by feel. And many tasks were done in darkness, complete darkness, hands knowing where things were, bodies understanding the space. When the lamp was extinguished, and it was always extinguished before sleep, the darkness became total. No streetlights, no neighbours' windows, no moon through thick forest and cloud, just the faint red glow from the stove seams. Just that. The darkness was not frightening. It was a signal. Work had ended. The body could rest now. Morning was still hours away, the last task before sleep, building the overnight fire. This was not simply adding wood. This was setting the stage for survival through the coldest hours. The trapper knelt before the open stove door, reading the coals. Their colour told him what he needed to know. Bright red and glowing meant they were ready. Dull grey meant more time was needed. He selected logs carefully. Dense hardwood, birch or maple if he had them. These would burn slowly through the night. He positioned the first log across the coal bed, not smothering the coals, allowing air to flow beneath. The second log went parallel to the first, leaving space between them. The third log completed the structure, laid across the top. He adjusted the damper, not closed completely. That would choke the fire, not open fully. That would burn too fast. He found the position that allowed just enough air. The flames settled into a steady rhythm, low, controlled, patient. Wood for night feeding sat within arm's reach of the bunk, 3 or 4 pieces, split to the right size. He would wake twice, maybe 3 times. Each time he would add 1 piece without fully emerging from the blankets. This pattern had become automatic. The security came from knowing the fire was properly set, knowing it would burn through the dark hours, knowing cold could be kept at bay. This was essential survival knowledge, passed from experienced trappers to new ones, refined over generations. A properly banked fire would sustain itself for 6 to 8 hours. It would keep the cabin's temperature above freezing while the world outside dropped to 40 below. He closed the stove door. The ritual was complete. He moved to the bunk. The evening routine had been a ceremony of survival, each action purposeful and tested by experience. He had transformed the frozen cabin into something that could sustain human life through another night. Now came the surrender to it. He pulled off his outer wool shirt, left his base layer on, his wool pants stayed, his socks stayed. He kept the wool cap on his head. His body needed to maintain warmth, but also needed to breathe. Too much clothing trapped moisture. Not enough allowed cold to penetrate. He climbed onto the platform. The spruce boughs compressed slightly under his weight. The caribou hide was cold at first touch. It would warm. He pulled the first blanket up, then the second, then the third. The rabbit fur robe came last, sewn from dozens of pelts, light but remarkably warm. He arranged the layers carefully around his shoulders and neck, created a seal that would hold his body heat. The temperature had already begun its nightly descent. He could feel it. The air on his face grew sharper. The cabin was cooling from the top down and outside in. But within the layered cocoon of fur and wool, warmth gathered. The red glow from the stove's seams provided the only light. Thin lines of illumination where the door met the frame, where the pipe entered the wall. These faint traces marked the location of the fire in the darkness. He settled into position on his side, knees drawn slightly up, arms tucked close. The position that conserved heat. The position his body knew. The fire ticked and popped softly. The cabin creaked as cold tightened the logs. Outside, the night forest was silent under deep cold. He closed his eyes. The darkness was complete. The night had its own language. Inside the cabin, the stove spoke constantly. Metal ticked as it expanded with heat. Logs popped when pockets of sap met flame. The sound was irregular, unpredictable, a soft percussion that marked the passage of time in a place where clocks meant nothing. The walls joined the conversation. As air temperatures dropped through the night, the logs settled. They creaked. The sounds were sharp sometimes, sudden cracks that could startle a man from the edge of sleep. Other times they groaned, long, slow complaints as wood contracted in the cold. The trapper's own breathing became part of the soundscape. In the complete silence, even quiet breath seemed loud. The rustle of blankets when he shifted, the scrape of wool against fur. These small sounds took on weight in the darkness. Outside, the forest spoke differently. Trees split from frost. The sound came without warning, a crack like a rifle shot that echoed through the night. It happened when sap froze and expanded, when internal pressure finally exceeded what the wood could hold. The sound could travel for miles in cold air. Wolves howled sometimes. The sound was distant most nights, haunting. It rose and fell, carried on air so cold it seemed to sharpen every note. Foxes barked closer, sharp, quick sounds that cut through the darkness. But beneath all these sounds lay something else. Silence. Not the absence of sound, but a presence of its own. Extreme cold created a peculiar quiet. Air itself seemed muffled, dense. Sound travelled differently at 40 below. The silence had physical weight. This was darkness without human noise. No engines, no voices, no electrical hum. Nothing man-made except the cabin and the trapper within it. In that silence, small sounds became everything. Time moved differently in the darkness. There were no clocks, no way to measure hours except by the fire's hunger. A trapper learned to judge time by how the stove felt when he woke, how much heat remained, how deep the coals glowed when he opened the door to feed them. Night became a series of territories. The first waking came perhaps 2 hours after sleep. The cabin still held warmth. The fire needed only 1 log. This feeding took minutes. The trapper barely left his blankets. He reached for wood he'd placed within arm's reach, opened the stove door, positioned the log, closed it again. The cold had not yet claimed the space. The second wake-in arrived deeper in the night. The air had cooled. Frost formed on the walls near the door. This feeding required more attention, 2 logs instead of 1, a moment to adjust the damper. The trapper rose to sitting, worked quickly, then burrowed back into the furs before cold could penetrate his layers. The third waking came in the hours before dawn. The cabin had reached its coldest point. The fire had burned low despite the earlier feedings. This territory required full waking. The trapper sat up completely, added 3 logs. Sometimes he rose from the bunk entirely, moved closer to the stove, let heat reach him directly before returning to bed. These wakings were not disruptions. They were the rhythm, the pulse of winter night. A man learned to wake without fully surfacing from sleep, to perform the necessary work in a state between dreaming and consciousness. The body knew what to do. Hands found wood, positioned it, closed the door, then sleep returned. In isolation, with no human voice for weeks, time itself transformed. Days blurred together. One night became every night. The pattern repeated until it felt less like repetition and more like a single continuous experience of darkness and fire and cold. There was no yesterday, no tomorrow, only the present territory of night, the fire's glow, the blanket's weight, the silence pressing against the walls. The warmth did not distribute evenly. Heat rose, always. The laws of physics did not pause for human need. As the fire burned through the night, the warmest air climbed toward the cabin's peaked ceiling. It accumulated there, trapped against the roof boards. The middle air held moderate warmth, comfortable if you stood, but the floor remained cold, always cold. Cold air is heavy, dense. It sinks like water finding the lowest point. Through the long hours of darkness, as the fire died from flames to coals to embers, the cold descended. It pooled at ground level, spread across the floorboards, crept into corners. By the coldest hour before dawn, the cabin held layers of temperature as distinct as rock strata. 70 degrees near the ceiling, 50 at shoulder height, 40 at the sleeping platform, below freezing at the floor. This is why the bed was elevated. Frost formed as the night progressed. On the iron nails driven through walls from outside, white crystals grew in delicate patterns. On the small window, oiled paper, or actual glass if the trapper had carried it in, ice built in feathered opacity. On the walls themselves, where chinking had gaps or moisture had settled, a thin skin of white appeared. The trapper's breath was visible even beneath the blankets. Each exhalation created a small cloud. In the microclimate of fur and wool, warmth held. But at the edges, where breath escaped into the cabin's air, condensation became visible. Sometimes it froze on the blanket's outer surface, small crystals forming where moisture met cold. The face felt it first, nose exposed to air, cheeks above the blanket line. These registered the drop in temperature, not painfully, not dangerously, but noticeably. The body's extremities always sense cold before the core. Hands outside the coverings would have gone numb in minutes, but tucked inside or held against the chest, they stayed functional. The trapper learned to keep everything vital within the envelope of warmth. Only the face remained exposed, and even that could be partially covered. A wool scarf wrapped loosely, not over the mouth where moisture would freeze, but around the neck and lower face. The stove itself created a zone of influence. Directly beside it, metal radiated heat even as the fire died. 3 feet away, warmth was noticeable. 6 feet away, only the faint suggestion remained. By morning, with the fire reduced to a handful of coals barely glowing, that zone had contracted. Heat hugged the iron. The rest of the cabin surrendered to cold's patient advance. This was expected. Not failure, but the natural progression of a winter night. The trapper did not wake surprised by cold. He woke knowing exactly what had happened in the hours of sleep. The fire had done its work, burned through the carefully positioned logs, released stored energy as heat and light. Now it needed renewal. The temperature would recover as soon as wood was added, as soon as flame took hold again. The cycle would reverse. Warmth would climb from the stove, spread outward, rise upward, push the cold back to the corners and the floor. But for now, in the last hour before dawn, the cabin rested in cold's temporary victory. There was no one to speak to for weeks, sometimes months. The trapper existed in a silence broken only by sounds he himself created. The crack of wood splitting, the scrape of a spoon against a plate, the shuffle of boots on floorboards, his own breath, his own movements. At night, this absence became profound. During daylight hours, work provided distraction. The body moved, the mind focused on tasks, checking traps, following tracks, cutting wood. But when darkness came and the small cabin enclosed him, when there was nothing left but to sit by the fire or lie in the sleeping platform, the solitude pressed in. Many trappers talked to themselves, not from madness, from need. The human voice is a social instrument. It expects response. In the absence of other voices, it calls to itself. A trapper might narrate his actions, time to bank the fire now, or offer observations to the empty room. Cold tonight, colder than yesterday. Some spoke to dogs. If a trapper kept 1 or 2 dogs, not sled teams, but companions who also served as alarm systems against predators, they became conversation partners. The dog did not answer in words, but it listened. Its ears moved. Its eyes tracked. That was enough. The psychological weight of speaking into complete non-response was heavier than speaking to an animal who acknowledged the sound. Others kept complete silence. They adapted to it. Let the absence of human voice become normal, found that the interior monologue of thought was sufficient. But even these men noted the strangeness, how their own voice sounded unfamiliar when they finally used it, how they had to consciously remember how to modulate tone and volume. Dreams became vivid. The mind, understimulated during waking hours, elaborated during sleep. Trappers reported dreams of extraordinary detail, conversations with family, scenes from settlements, the smell of bread baking, the sound of children laughing, spring arriving in impossible abundance. Some dreams were of warmth itself, standing in summer sun, swimming in water, sitting by a massive fire in a great hall. The sleeping mind sought what the waking body lacked. Time behaved differently in isolation. Without social cues or schedules imposed by others, the trapper's sense of hours became internal, elastic. A night could feel brief or endless depending on sleep quality and the fire's demands. Days blurred into one another. The only markers were the position of the sun and the slow accumulation of pelts. Senses sharpened in unexpected ways. Hearing became acute. The trapper learned to distinguish the crack of frost-split wood from the snap of a branch breaking under snow. Smell intensified. He could detect the faint scent of smoke from his own clothing. Touch registered minute differences in temperature and texture. This was adaptation. The nervous system, deprived of complex social input, redirected attention to the physical environment. What might seem like loss of human contact was also a deepening relationship with place, the cabin, the forest, the cold. These became company of a kind, not replacement for human presence, but sufficient. Trappers who returned to settlements after months alone often reported needing days to adjust. The noise of multiple voices was overwhelming, the constant social negotiation exhausting. Some found they had come to prefer the silence. In the darkness of the cabin, lying in furs with the stove ticking softly, the trapper was alone, completely. And in that aloneness, a strange peace could be found. The cabin walls were thin, 1.5 inches of hewn logs, perhaps 2 inches where chinking filled the gaps. Not much separation between inside and outside, not much barrier between warmth and wilderness. Sound passed through easily. At night, the forest was not silent. It was alive with movement, with voices, with the business of animals that lived their entire lives in conditions that would kill an unprepared human in hours. The trapper learned to listen, learned to read the night by ear, a scratch at the base of the wall, small claws on wood, a mouse or red squirrel working along the cabin's edge, investigating. The sound was close, immediate. The animal was inches away, separated only by logs and darkness. The high, sharp bark of a fox, territorial, moving through the forest on its own trapline, hunting the same snowshoe hares the trapper sought. The bark came from different locations as the animal travelled, here, then there, then gone. The scream of a lynx carried differently. It was a sound that stopped thought, a cry that seemed human and not human at once, piercing, wild. The lynx moved silently most of the time, but when it vocalized, the sound cut through cold air and cabin walls as if neither existed. These were not threats. They were companions, proof that life continued in the frozen dark, proof that the night belonged to more than one species. If the trapper kept a dog, it slept near the stove or by the door. It raised its head at certain sounds, ignored others. The dog knew what mattered and what did not. Its breathing was another presence, another rhythm in the small space. The cabin was a point of warmth in a landscape dominated by animal life, a single lit match in an ocean of cold and dark. The animals knew it was there. They moved around it, sometimes toward it, Always aware, the trapper understood what moved beyond the walls, understood by sound alone. The first weeks were hardest. Sleep came in short pieces. The cold woke him, the fire woke him, the strangeness of it all woke him. But the body learned. Over weeks and months, sleep changed. It became lighter, more fractured, but also more adapted to what the winter required. The trapper no longer fully woke when he rose to feed the fire. He moved in a state between sleep and waking. Added wood, adjusted the damper, returned to the blankets, slipped back under without breaking the deeper rest his body held in reserve. His metabolism shifted. He generated heat differently, burned fuel more efficiently. The body understood that it would spend months in cold, and it made adjustments that could not be consciously controlled. The quality of rest changed too. It was not the sleep of summer, not the deep, uninterrupted dark of a warm bed in a warm house, but it was sufficient. It was rest earned by physical exhaustion, by the security of tested shelter, by the knowledge that the fire burned and the walls stood, and morning would come. Some trappers noted that their bodies produced less odor in extreme cold. Sweat froze before it could sour. Skin adapted to dryness. The body became a winter body, different from what it had been in September. This was not comfort, but it was survival. And the body, given time, learned what survival required. The trapper woke in darkness, complete darkness, no grey at the window, no outline of the door frame, no sense of separation between the walls and the ceiling and the space where his breath hung in the air. He woke because something inside him said it was time. Not a clock, not the sun, just the body's internal measure of hours passed in stillness. The cabin was cold now, not freezing. The fire had done its work through the night, but the stove had quieted. The warmth that pooled near the ceiling hours ago had thinned. The cold from the floor had risen. He did not move immediately. He lay still under the weight of wool and fur, listening. The stove ticked softly. Outside, nothing. No wind, no movement, just the vast silence of cold that meant the temperature had dropped further in the hours before dawn. He knew what came next. He shifted one arm free from the blankets. The air bit at his skin. He reached toward the stove. He knew exactly where it sat, even in absolute dark, and lifted the iron lid. A few coals remained, dull red, barely glowing. He fed kindling into the firebox without leaving the bunk. Small sticks within arm's reach, dry bark. He had placed them there before sleep. The coals brightened as air reached them. The kindling caught. Now he moved. He slid from beneath the furs, wool socks finding the cold floor, and crouched near the stove. He added larger pieces, split wood. The flames grew. He dressed in layers near the fire's light, long underwear already on, wool shirt pulled over his head, trousers, second shirt, the motions automatic. The water bucket sat frozen beside the stove. Solid ice. He placed it directly on the hot surface and waited. The fire roared now. He had fed it carefully, building heat, rebuilding warmth. The stove's iron sides began to glow faintly in the darkness, still no light outside. He pulled on his outer layers, canvas trousers, wool vest, the heavy coat left near the door, mucklucks laced tight, the hat pulled low, and then he waited, sitting on the edge of the bunk, watching the stove, feeling warmth return to the cabin's core. The grey came slowly. Not dawn, not sunrise, just a lessening of darkness. The window's outline became visible, a square of deep blue-grey against black. The light grew gradually, without announcement. The world outside separating into forms, the shape of trees, the white plain of snow, the dark line where forest met clearing. He stood and moved to the door. The latch was stiff with cold. He lifted it and pulled. The air hit him. Shocking. Immediate. A wall of cold that pushed into the cabin and pulled the warmth toward the ceiling. He stepped outside. The world had transformed again. Fresh snow overnight, 2 inches, perhaps 3. The surface unmarked except for the delicate trails of small animals, fox tracks leading toward the woodpile, the paired prints of a hare near the tree line. The sky was pale, colourless. The sun not yet visible, but its approach implied in the grey light spreading across the eastern horizon. He stood in the cold and breathed. The air burned his lungs, sharp, clean. Behind him, the cabin's warmth spilled through the open door. Ahead, the forest waited, silent, frozen, the trapline stretching into the trees. Morning had arrived. The day would begin now. Work would follow, the cycle continuing. Evening would come. Night would return. The fire would be banked again, and he would sleep again in the small sanctuary of logs and warmth, knowing the methods held, the knowledge remained. As it had for generations before, morning preparing to become day, day preparing to become evening. Evening preparing to become night again. This was the cycle that defined winter trapline life. Repetitive, purposeful, unbroken. Each day followed the pattern established by the one before. The trapper rose in darkness, rebuilt the fire, ate, dressed in layers, stepped into cold, walked the line, checked traps, reset what needed resetting, returned before light failed, fed the fire, prepared food, dried what was wet, banked the stove, slept, woke, fed the fire, slept again. The pattern held because it worked. Each night survived was proof of the system's effectiveness. The cabin stood, the fire sustained, the body adapted, the knowledge passed down through generations of trappers, French-Canadian, Métis, indigenous, remained sound. Spring, when it finally came, brought relief. But it also brought adjustment. The quiet intensity of winter life was its own world. Some trappers returned year after year, despite hardships. The winter wilderness held something compelling, not comfort, not ease, but a kind of equilibrium. A person alone with cold and fire and forest, finding competence in survival itself. Their journals sometimes describe the beauty of winter nights, the stars, the aurora, the pristine silence. And beneath those observations a common thread, pride in endurance, in the ability to thrive where survival was an accomplishment. The trapper slept in layers of fur and wool. The fire burned low through the night. The cold pressed against log walls. And morning came. It always came. The fire always rekindled. The trapper always rose to walk his line again. This was the knowledge that allowed humans to find not just survival, but a strange peace in the frozen dark. Within that small cabin, with fire tended and bedding built from the materials at hand, a person could rest. The cold was a fact, not a problem to solve, but a condition to work within. The night had its terms. The trapper accepted them, and in that acceptance found sleep.